The test is in 4 sections. At the end of the test, you will be given 10 minutes to transfer your answers to an answer sheet. Now turn to Section 1. Section 1. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 5. Now we shall begin. You should answer the questions as you listen because you will not hear the recording a second time. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 5.
It is only natural to feel somewhat nervous before giving a speech, and while a few nerves never did any harm, and can in fact prove beneficial, letting your nerves overcome you can be detrimental. Today's presentation will focus on ways to control those butterflies and help you to give better presentations in future. First and foremost, you've got to know your material. I can't stress that enough. If you fail to prepare, you might as well prepare to fail. Even the most experienced speakers never turn up unprepared and never try to wing it. Personalize your subject and use humour, anecdotes and conversational language. This will make it easier for you to remember what you want to say. Secondly, practice, practice, practice. Rehearse well in advance and preferably out loud and with all the equipment you plan on using. Practice your timing, when to pause and when to breathe, and prepare for the unexpected. Something always goes wrong, especially when you're relying on technology, so always have a backup plan. Get to know your audience before you have to stand up in front of them. Meet and greet them on the way in, perhaps. It is much easier to talk to a group of friends than a group of strangers. And, just as importantly, know your room as well. Arrive early, pace the speaking area, and practice using the microphone and visual aids. The hardest part is trying to relax. Never rush straight into your speech. Begin slowly and address the audience first. In fact, even before you start, take a few deep breaths. You know, 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. This will turn your nervous energy into enthusiasm.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 6 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 6 to 10.
Visualization can be a great confidence booster. Visualize yourself making the speech in the way that you intend. Imagine your voice loud and confident, and picture the audience clapping and rooting for you. Remember, people want you to succeed. The audience wants to hear an interesting and insightful speech. They aren't hoping you make a fool of yourself. Whatever you do, avoid making unnecessary apologies. If you make a mistake or two, forget about it. Few will notice, and it will all be forgotten before too long. People often forget the importance of body language. Don't underestimate this. Your words carry far less meaning than your delivery. Success is defined by your intonation and confidence. If you come across as a confident person, people will listen to you. You will command their attention. Stand tall and proud and deliver with conviction. Humans are very bad listeners. We remember less than 25% of what is said and place far more emphasis on how it is said. Last of all, be realistic and give yourself a chance. No one becomes the perfect speaker overnight. It takes time to hone your presentation skills.
That is the end of section 1. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 2. Section 2. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 16. Now listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 16.
Good evening and welcome to this month's Observatory Club lecture. I'm Donald Mackey and I'm here to talk to you about the solar eclipse in history. 1,000 years ago, a total eclipse of the sun was a terrifying religious experience. But these days, an eclipse is more likely to be viewed as a tourist attraction than as a scientific or spiritual event. People will travel literally miles to be in the right place at the right time to get the best view of their eclipse. Well, what exactly causes a solar eclipse when the world goes dark for a few minutes in the middle of the day? Scientifically speaking, the dark spot itself is easy to explain. It's the shadow of the moon streaking across the Earth. This happens every year or two, each time along a different, and to all intents and purposes, a seemingly random piece of the globe. In the past, people often interpreted an eclipse as a danger signal heralding disaster, and in fact the Chinese were so disturbed by these events that they included among their gods one whose job it was to prevent eclipses. But whether or not you're superstitious or take a purely scientific view, our earthly eclipses are special in 3 ways. Firstly, there can be no doubt that they're very beautiful. It's as if a deep blue curtain had fallen over the daytime sky as the sun becomes a black void surrounded by the glow of its outer atmosphere. But beyond this, total eclipses possess a second, more compelling beauty in the eyes of us scientists, for they offer a unique opportunity for research. Only during an eclipse can we study the corona and other dim things that are normally lost in the sun's glare. And thirdly, they are rare. Even though an eclipse of the sun occurs somewhere on Earth every year or two, if you sit in your garden and wait, it will take 375 years on average for one to come to you. If the moon were any larger, eclipses would become a monthly bore. If it were smaller, they simply would not be possible. The ancient Babylonian priests, who spent a fair bit of time staring at the sky, had already noted that there was an 18-year pattern in their occurrence, but they didn't have the mathematics to predict an eclipse accurately.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 17 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 17 to 20.
It was Edmund Halley, the English astronomer, who knew his maths well enough to predict the return of the comet, which incidentally bears his name, and in 1715 he became the first person to make an accurate eclipse prediction. This brought eclipses firmly into the scientific domain, and they've since allowed a number of important scientific discoveries to be made. For instance, in the eclipse of 1868, two scientists, Janssen and Lockyer, were observing the sun's atmosphere, and it was these observations that ultimately led to the discovery of a new element. They named the element helium, after the Greek god of the sun. This was a major find, because helium turned out to be the most common element in the universe after hydrogen. Another great triumph involved Mercury. I'll just put that up on the board for you now. See, there's Mercury, the planet closest to the sun, then Venus, Earth, etc. For centuries, scientists had been unable to understand why Mercury appeared to rotate faster than it should. Some astronomers suggested that there might be an undiscovered planet causing this unusual orbit, and even gave it the name Vulcan. During the eclipse of 1878, an American astronomer, James Watson, thought he'd spotted this so-called lost planet. But, alas for him, he was later obliged to admit that he'd been wrong about Vulcan and withdrew his claim. Then Albert Einstein came on the scene. Einstein suggested that, rather than being wrong about the number of planets, astronomers were actually wrong about gravity. Einstein's theory of relativity, for which he's so famous, disagreed with Newton's law of gravity in just the right way to explain Mercury's odd orbit. He also realized that a definitive test would be possible during the total eclipse of 1919, and this is indeed when his theory was finally proved correct. So there you have several examples of how eclipses have helped to increase our understanding of the universe. And now let's move on to the social aspects. And I think
That is the end of section 2. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 3. Section 3. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 26.
That's right. I started out working as a researcher in Kelheim Laboratories, though it's a long time ago now.
What was it like then? Starting out, I mean. That'll be us next year.
It largely depends on your work environment, really. My team in the biophysics department were not very understanding of how it feels to be a new guy, and were really quite hard on me. From day one, they expected me to pull my weight, and they reprimanded me for any mistakes I made. There was no time for me to find my feet and get comfortable.
That sounds awful.
Well, it was to begin with, and it certainly took a long time for me to gain their respect. But once I had done, the work environment became far more pleasant, and indeed we ended up making a great team.
How long did you stay there?
6 years.
You did a fair stint then?
Yes, well, you see, I was offered a promotion in my 5th year to assistant manager. Needless to say, I jumped at the chance. I had got to know the manager really well during my time there, though, and I knew, based on how quick he was to point out what you were doing wrong all the time, that it would be a challenge to have to work closely with him. But I've never been one not to accept a challenge.
So how did you and he get on?
Well, it didn't matter, as he was only there another 6 months. He took early retirement on account of a heart condition, and before you knew it, there I was, managing the entire operation.
Was that difficult for you?
Not at all. I was very fortunate to then be managing the same team as I had been part of for so long. They were at ease with me and the way I did things, so the department functioned really well for a time.
Only for a time?
Yes, until I got into a dispute with the directors. You see, being new to management, I'd never dealt with directors or the like before, and their expectations were just not very practical. They had their head in the clouds, if you ask me. Anyway, they expected me to get instant results in our lab work. Needless to say, I wasn't prepared to rush the delicate experiments we were conducting along too quickly. I stood my ground and made it clear that I had no wish to pressure my team, and that, in my eyes, they could have as much time as they liked to find out what they were looking for. This didn't go down too well with the directors, and they got rid of me.
You mean you were sacked?
In a manner of speaking. Well, they told me to leave of my own accord or I would be removed. I left.
And is that when you started to lecture?
Yes, and I've been doing it ever since. When I first arrived, Dr. Michael Stout was still a member of staff here.
You mean the programme director?
Well, he wasn't back then. I have Michael to thank for showing me the ropes. He was very considerate of the new faculty members and assisted me no end. And now, here I am, 20 years a lecturer. How time flies.
Well, sir, we're very glad to have you as ours, that's for sure.
Yeah, you make all the stuff sound so interesting, unlike some of them.
Couldn't agree more. Honestly, I almost fall asleep in the other classes.
Now, come on. I'm neither that good, nor are your other lecturers that bad.
Before you hear the rest of the discussion, you have some time to look at questions 27 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 27 to 30.
Right, now let's get down to business. We didn't meet for an idle chat. Tell me, John, how's the project coming along?
Well, we haven't been able to isolate the mutant gene yet, so to be honest, I'd say it's slow progress.
But you have at least identified the mutant gene, correct?
Yeah, but until we isolate it, testing cannot commence, so the whole project is on hold at the moment.
I think you're being a little too hard on yourselves. After all, correct me if I'm wrong, but did we not say a time frame of maybe 6 months just to identify the culprit?
Yes, but having done that so quickly in the space of a week, it's frustrating to have to wait now.
Patience is a skill you have yet to acquire, John.
I guess.
We have managed to establish that the gene mutation bypasses every other generation.
Intriguing. So the infection is not passed directly from parent to child?
No. If the parent is infected, the child will be a silent carrier who will go on to infect any children he or she has.
That's an important discovery.
Yes, and we've also found a way to switch off the mutant gene, we think.
Go on.
One of the volunteers we have been studying was a carrier 6 months ago, but the mutation is no longer in his DNA. Having studied his health records, it seems that he caught a strain of bird flu on a trip to Malaysia. He had a near-death experience, but has since made a full recovery.
Do you suspect the bird flu virus somehow has a curative effect?
We don't think it was the virus, but the accompanying fever. His body temperature was raised to 105. We have a hypothesis that the mutant gene couldn't cope with such an excessive internal body temperature.
Excellent work. So, by the sounds of it, a cure might not be too far away?
If we can isolate the gene, then we can begin further research to confirm our hypothesis.
Now I understand why you're so eager.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 4. Section 4. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
The best way to attract birds to your garden is by satisfying their basic needs, which are the need for water, the need for food, and the need for safety. Birds drink water and bathe in it, and many also use it to make mud to build their nests. A simple bird bath, which can be nothing more complicated than a shallow dish, will therefore attract birds. Don't use tin pans, as these get hot under the heat of the sun. In fact, a cement bowl is probably going to be the most effective bath to use. But make sure that it is no more than 6.5 centimetres deep. The best time of all to attract birds to your garden, and indeed the time when they need your help most, is during the winter season. During summer, birds can find most of their food on their own, and are largely self-sufficient. In winter, however, they benefit greatly from the help of their human friends. Often, when it is cold, an ice or frost crust may form over the ground, covering the birds' natural food supply. It is when this happens that they really need your help with feeding. It is probably best, though, to start feeding from late autumn onwards. That way the birds will become used to finding food in a certain spot. So later, after the onset of the winter, they will become a permanent feature in your garden. Put food out at night so that the birds will find it the next morning. And whatever you do, make sure that you make your feeder accessible from a raised landing area only. Otherwise, you will find yourself attracting some unwanted pests such as rodents like mice, and worse still, rats. Continue feeding until early spring, when food becomes plentiful again. If you cannot serve them insects, then try to give the birds suet, a form of beef fat. You can buy this cheaply at pretty much any meat market, so it won't cost you an arm and a leg. As well as being nourishing, suet also has the advantage of not freezing during cold weather. Many birds will also enjoy crumbs, nuts and seeds. You can even serve them boiled potatoes and hard-boiled eggs, provided these are finely chopped. Other foods you probably have lying around in your store cupboard may also be used. Try feeding them raisins, figs, dried fruit generally, biscuits, boiled rice, and so on as well. If you want to build a birdhouse or nesting box, I would encourage you to proceed by all means. These offer fine protection, especially for the smaller and more vulnerable species. You can buy ready-made nesting boxes and shelves for a very reasonable price these days. Alternatively, if you fancy doing a little DIY, they are not very difficult to build either. Most birds prefer houses made of rough slabs of wood covered with bark, which to the birds feels quite authentic and natural. If at all possible, try to match your birdhouse to the surroundings as well. So, if you paint your birdhouse, be sure to use a dull grey, green or brown colour. The simplest type of birdhouse to construct yourself consists of a hollow branch nailed to a tree. When you are erecting your birdhouses, be sure to place them a good distance apart from one another. Few bird species enjoy nesting in close proximity to competitors of their own kind. Cleanliness is vitally important too. Your bird nest should be cleaned out yearly to make room for new nesting material to be brought in by their seasonal tenants. Early autumn is the best time to prepare your birdhouse, as the new season's chicks will have hatched and flown the coop, so to speak. Once cleaned, your birdhouses will be ready to welcome their spring visitors once they return to your neighbourhood early the next year.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.